Thank you all, and we're about to start the second session, which is titled Social and Cultural Mechanisms, and our first presenter is Terry Clark, who's going to be speaking on scenes and local effects.
I briefly review past examples of how context has played an active theoretical role, and then introduce our work on scenes as a new approach which synthesizes some past lessons about how contexts work. Background suggestions. Be suspicious of any single explanation. Talk to participants. See what some of their theories are. Ask enough to build a set of multiple factors that you may combine or conflict and have competing interpretations. Reconsider assumptions. I guess this is my small footnote to economists. Try to replace assumptions with variations in context of thinking of how one context fits better one assumption rather than another, instead of having them purely abstract. State competing models explicitly. Compare contrasting cases to see how context can shift theoretically competing drivers. The context is integral to the theory. Context can specify how and why two or more models may each hold in different situations. For instance, there was a huge debate in the community power literature of Floyd Hunter versus Robert Dahl. Hunter held that capitalism and business drove cities, while Dahl stressed politics and competition among interest groups. 166 case studies followed. To transcend this, Pete Rossi, Bob Crane, and I started the Newark Permanent Community Sample and surveyed mayors, council members, business leaders in the first national comparative study of community power. We found that some cities were business-dominated, others were politically dominated. Why? This was a new theoretical question that became part of the local context of how does it transform the decision-making process. And some 700 of us joined to answer this in the Fiscal Austerity and Urban Innovation Project, completed in over 10,000 cities in 35 countries, and there have been some 50 books which have dealt with these issues. The Fowey urban data permit us to measure not just business, important as many have talked about capitalism as a more abstract concept, like Althusser, who maintained that not business leaders, but the capitalist system is critical. Yet comparing variations across cities inside Poland, the Czech Republic, Yugoslavia, pre- and post-1989, we found big variations interpretable with models used in the US and Western Europe. Like economic and social diversity generate specifics of political competition. Capitalism is part, but just one part of the story. What they really talked, fought, and killed about in Eastern Europe was ethnicity. And even inductive factor analyses of new urban data generated traditional spatial classifications of regions like Bosnia and Serbia. This led some of us to look more closely at ethnicity in the US and to a paper, for instance, called The Irish Ethic and the Spirit of Patronage. The title tells the story. The old Chicago politics model was more important nationally to explain city government spending than income, party, race, citizen preferences, or any other classic variable. The more Irish Catholics in the city, the higher the spending, especially for police and fire. We lost a page here. As societies grow more open, we need more concepts to capture what people do and why. And as people do things in new ways, they look for new places away from the home, the church, and the factory. Enter the scene. 5 dimensions, which I let you read briefly, and I'm trying to pass over as much as I can the formal definitions, and methodology, and to stay with a fairly small number of models and more general points. For the quantitative sources, what we're trying to do is to retain some of the sensitivity to complexity of ethnographers, but discipline this by comparative methods and quantitative analysis. We use 4 main sources: census, electronic yellow pages, citizen surveys, and qualitative ethnographic work. For the quantitative sources, we collect data for hundreds of individual amenities like Baptist churches and tattoo parlors. We assign weights to each amenity based on its relative importance on each of 15 abstract dimensions, like neighborliness and self-expression. We then count the number of each of these types of amenities in each zip code in the US. This generates then we analyze these in multiple ways. One of the most common is to create one measure we call a scenes performance measure, of which we have 15, roughly based on counting the number of each of the types of amenities, such as a tattoo parlor, in each zip code, multiplying it by its weight, then dividing by the total number of amenities that there are within that zip code. These generate scores on each of the 15 dimensions for some 43,000 zip codes in the US, and similar units we're studying with collaborators in Spain, France, Poland, Germany, Canada, US, Japan, Korea, and China. How do scenes add value to local effects modeling? Most urban studies use controls and context measures, which, why? They're often chosen in ad hoc or at least atomistic manner as separate variables without conceptualized interrelations. This fits with much economic and psychological theory, but it violates the holistic strain of sociologists and anthropologists. Scenes build meaning across hundreds of individual variables by joining them in indexes that are analogous, in a sense, to the big five personality dimensions that capture the core elements of past work, theoretically and methodologically. The 15 abstract dimensions of scenes shown here are then they're abstract enough that they can be recombined into more specifics, like Bohemia or Disney Heaven or many others globally, which may vary in France and China and whatever. We do not oppose any past social science theories, but we seek to add scenes as contexts that redefine, heighten, or suppress different models conceptually and provide measures of each. These leads to methods stressing multi-causality, interaction effects, shifting the relative importance of different drivers within regions or other contexts as captured by methods like quantile analysis or geographically weighted regression, and associated mapping and spatial techniques. One clear finding I'll talk about a little bit is a factor analysis of the 15 dimensions generating a first factor similar to the urbane communal dimension from Tunney's, Louis Wirth, and others. It looks very similar in national maps to some of the big five types: conscientiousness, agreeable, and extroverted on the one side. And these run, this is an example of the Bohemian scene, and then here's our map. This is a score on the first factor, which runs from the south up to the small Midwestern towns. Conversely, the two coastal areas are very high in terms of the big five on openness, neuroticism, and self-expression. On our measures, this is really the low end of that index. So we notice New England or New York up through parts of New England and California and the like are one extreme. The South and Midwest are very much the opposite. Look at the same. This is okay. If we then look at some components of it, these are 1, 2, 3, 4 of the 15 dimensions only. But again, they map reasonably into a coastal, west, and southern up through the Midwest kind of classification. Fairly simplistic, but broad. If we do the same thing inside Chicago neighborhoods, these look like Rob Sampson's. How about that? From very different data. One clear finding then is these similarities which demand further elaboration. If we look, for instance, at neighborliness versus self-expression and how they overlap dramatically with the personality big five, my Bronzeville neighbors and I are proud of our neighborliness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. We are not neurotic North Siders. If I didn't tell you these were value dimensions, you might think that they were race or something else. Yet values, unlike race, are not primordial. They can change. this redefines whole classes of models and suggests especially critically different policy implications. So this is the personality maps. Now again, see the same thing, conscientiousness up from the south, open to experience, Southern California, New York, etc. So we see very similar patterns with these two kinds of, and this is again agreeable. This is agreeable is how we think of it in Bronzeville. And extroverted people are neighborly. They talk to one another, not like those North Siders, okay, who are just neurotic people, okay? So properly placed. We have similar things internationally. Just to give you a flavor that these can then be intercorrelated with things like the percentage of young people, and looked at for consistency across cities and regions. And this is not something I'm talking about substantively, but I just used it as it shows a simple interaction effect, which is often the way we want to conceptualize the scenes operating and transforming a simple X to Y kind of pattern into an interaction relation. This one didn't come. Oops, we lost two of these. Okay, well, I'll tell you what these say. This you might think that's franglais, but I'll get to that in a minute. We are here in the 4-mile downtown area. Yeah, there we go. This is economics. We're in the 4-mile downtown area of Chicago, which relative to the metro growth is the fastest growing downtown in the entire United States. Why? Our main thrust is to break up population and job growth by subtypes and model each separately, along with innovation measured by patents. Young people move for different reasons from retirees and so forth. The retirees move for the weather, the young people move for more constructed amenities. Dan Silver and I have been detailing many distinct models and scene dynamics in our book on scenes. I'll show just a few to illustrate, and he'll fill in much more. We deliberately focus on these widely studied classic variables from past models, urban economists, geographers, and others, to which we add scenes variables to try to identify distinct effects along with the classic variables used by most others. One model of economic growth we estimated to explain change in jobs, change in employment, using the main drivers of economists, urban economists and geographers. Then we added the scenes and found that arts jobs, glamour, and self-expression were more important than crime, cost of living, or population size. Glamour and self-expression were very strong in Los Angeles, but they were weak in New York and Chicago. Local cultures transform models. Consider self-expression, which we saw on the map, so I'm going to trace this through just a little bit for reasons of time. In the last year, with collaborators, we've completed short monographs on scenes in China, France, and Korea. One big theme is how do local scenes build confidence in civic life, very close to Rob Sampson's concepts. And one of our sections is called Bowling Alone or Karaoke Together, that the models must change, and they do change dramatically when we move outside Western Europe and the US. Tocqueville never went to Japan. Okay. And I'll focus, however, on Tocqueville's key variable, churches. These are also the #1 amenity for many churches, many citizens and neighborhoods in many parts of the world today. Tocqueville stressed it as a source of grassroots civil society. Our new scenes data show the extent of his observation. Consider the spatial concentration of churches. And what this is the percent of, doesn't even have the number there, this is the percent of churches of all other kinds of organizations in the US. And we see that it is 70% of 9 organizations we show here. These are standard government agency classification of organizational types used internationally semi-comparably. And the same types in the US and France show that in the US, 70% of all organizations are churches. In France, the corresponding number is 2.7%. And in France, the Catholic churches are centrally located as part of the establishment. 0.91 is the factor weight for churches on the first factor of 10 types of organizations in France. In the US, it is 0.02, which shows that US churches are in very different places from other organizations. Our regressions for all US zip codes show many churches are in zips with non-whites, low rent, and higher crime. What differences might such associational or other activities make for citizens in these societies? Race and primordial ties are often seen as foundations of intractable conflict. Race remains the deepest socio-political cleavage in the US, but how might local scenes transform the dynamics of race? We split the 43,000 zip codes into fifths on one of our 15 scenes dimensions, self-expression, chosen as it is key to dynamic local areas generally. Then we re-estimated the models 5 times and looked at changes in the coefficients. How does it relate to churches and race? In each of the 3 quintiles, of American zip codes with the least self-expressive scenes, where there are more non-whites, there are typically more churches. However, the relationship weakens in the 4th quintile before falling to insignificance in the 5th quintile, which has the most self-expressive scenes. In these scenes, knowing which place has more or less non-whites tells us nothing about how many churches it has. If we repeat this analysis not using self-expression but traditionalism, we find that the relationship is reversed. Across quintiles of traditionalism, race is strongly associated with churches in the most traditional zip codes, not significant in the least traditional zip codes. Primordial identity thus becomes a variable. In traditional scenes, religion connects directly with ethnic identity. But in more self-expressive scenes, religion is more a personal resource for individual meaning, while its ethnic attachment weakens. Changes in scenes like self-expression and tradition redefine race and religion. People's race may not change, but scenes can redefine how people think and act as if or how race matters. In Bronzeville, civic groups are adding banners, produce markets, public concerts, and maybe self-expression. I'm working on a number of boards with other people there, and these are visible concerns of people who are dealing with scarce funds. Repeating such quantile analyses with geographically weighted regression shows the impact of race as a driver such that varying race impacts can be mapped across the US by neighborhood, some of the kinds of methods that the geographers in ArcGIS have been very creatively adding to our arsenal. In related analyses, Joseph Yee, Chris Grazio, and Dan Silver have identified the distinctive importance of some critical change agents for racial tolerance, including evangelical churches and martial arts clubs. James Murdoch has shown how these strong church and community scenes, especially in the US South, reduce loneliness, especially for African American men. And part of this is now underway in the last year with Louise Hockley, or several of us who really organized this conference, to try to join people working on local effects and related issues in sociology, political science, parts of, ideally, 20 or so faculty across the university, sharing data, joining concepts, and the like. Still, I leave further details. Here's the overview of chapters of the book. I point out that the very talented senior co-author is Dan Silver. I'm the junior co-author of the book. And I conclude with just a few big policy implications, which you can read, and I'll just point out to you the last one. Think like a movie director, not like a military leader. That's all. Okay.
Thank you, Terry. The next paper is by Daniel Silver on scenes and back to the land, onto the scene.
Okay, hi everybody. Good to be here. I'm just going to get right to it because time is short and I have a lot to say. So here we all are. We got, I don't know, about 100 people or so, and we're talking about how to include local area processes in our social science theory and models and so on. And we might just pause for a second and ask ourselves why we would want to do that. I mean, we have a lot of brain power in the room. We could be using it for a lot of different things, and we decided to do it in this way. And I mean, what could be more obvious, simply just more obvious than the fact that your day-to-day local surroundings, contacts, activities, resources strongly influence your behavior, your attitudes, your decisions, your opportunities, your fortunes, and a lot more. And it is, of course, obvious in some sense. And so we might ask ourselves, how could we have ever missed it? What picture of the world could have blocked us, let's say the broad social sciences community, from recognizing and doing full justice to the local in our thinking? And that's what I'm going to be talking about for the most part today. I'll be telling a story about the concept of land, which classically, in many related social science traditions, has been the concept that picks out the ways in which characteristics of local places impact or related to all sorts of other things. And I'll talk briefly, somewhat schematically, about that concept of land in the ways it was initially important for people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, how it sort of more or less dropped out of the picture in Marx, which with big consequences. And then I'll talk about a different tradition in which land never really dropped out, how it got brought back in with people like Max Weber, Alfred Marshall, and Talcott Parsons. And then I'll suggest that this idea of the scene extends and gives a lot more concrete, substantive meaning to what people like Weber, Marshall, and Parsons were onto. Okay, so how we lost place when we lost the concept of land and how we could bring it back in. Okay, so here we go. Part one, back to the land. So factors of production as a kind of social theory. Now, not many sociologists read economists, not only the formal modeling that we heard about earlier, but even the classical economists. And that is actually pretty unfortunate. The classical economists were among the original modern social thinkers, and many of our problems are inheritances from them. Now, I teach at University of Toronto our Introduction to Classical Social Theory course, and the first book that we read is The Wealth of Nations. And we read that before we get to Marx and Tocqueville. And there's something, I mean, every time I read that book every year, it's a kind of amazing experience in a certain way, because you can't read it without getting the feeling that you're looking at the sociological equivalent of early astronomy, right? Instead of having somebody looking up at the sky and seeing order, where before you would have only seen random movements, instead you have a mind looking out at the social world and you see order, where before you would have thought that there were just individual and personal idiosyncrasies. Now, what Smith does in the book, and this is just the important background here, is he laid the classical foundation for the division of society into three great classes: the landlords, the workers, and the capitalists. And that division was based on a theory of how the proceeds of labor that make up national wealth, and for him that meant the total goods and services produced in a given nation, how that could be divided up. And that wealth can go to profits, wages, or rents, and profits are the proceeds of capital, wages of labor, and rents of land. And those are the three classical factors of production. Hey. Button. There we go. Okay. We're still there. So now on that basis, Smith went on to develop a pretty powerful theory, a social theory of a lot of different things, including social conflict, which sociologists should probably pay more attention to, because it would alert us to some problems in our sort of textbook version of him as the sort of godfather of capitalismus. Because in his theory of social conflict, for instance, he argues that the interests of capitalists, are inherently hostile to the overall good of society, while those of the workers are inherently aligned with societies. The problem is that owners know and can act on their interests, while workers do not and cannot. And landlords, as the big point here, is that are in a strange middle position for Smith. Their interests, he thought, ultimately did align with those of society, but they tend, landlords, to misrecognize those and align themselves with the owners of capital. That's a longer story for a different time. But the key thing you start to see when you think about what this concept land means in Smith and others is that land is the value of place. Right? Now, for Smith, this land rent nexus was quite important, but he didn't really develop the theory of rent and the theory of land nearly as far as did David Ricardo. Now, he ended up producing a very intricate theory, which we're not going to get into in any detail, but the underlying intuitive logic is quite simple, but it leads to important consequences. So just imagine two farmers, each works about the same amount of time per day, has more or less the same set of tools, that is, labor and capital are the same. You put farmer number one on the good soil there, on the rich, fertile soil, farmer number two on the ugly and the bad. Crack soil, farmer number one is going to be more productive. He'll end up with that nice-looking farm, whereas the other one will end up with that bad-looking one. Now, that's, of course, intuitive and not deep in any way, but Ricardo did draw out some pretty important consequences from it. But what is important now in the present context is that you can see that the concept of land pretty directly focuses our analytical attention on specific characteristics of a locality. At first, how fertile the soil is, but also air quality, sunlight, qualities like distance and access to markets and suppliers, and so on. So including land in your model as a factor of production in this way naturally leads into having on your radar local area characteristics. So the next part now is called the eclipse of land as the eclipse of distance. Now, I said in my course we start with The Wealth of Nations. Next, after that, we go on to Marx, and we spend a lot of time with Capital. Capital is a book that's impossible to summarize briefly, but even so, one thing that strikes me every time I read Capital, when I read, each year, is that land is not in there. It's all about capital versus labor, bourgeois versus proletariat. And that clash, of course, brings about the class struggle that has defined the history of all hitherto existing history. Now, Marx had his reasons, and they're important to recognize, for downplaying land. He had economic and technological reasons. He was sitting there in England and looking around at changes going on around him, and agricultural technology certainly had improved, and that made the physical qualities of the earth seem less like gifts of nature and more like something subject to human technological mastery, capital, that is. And so land scarcity and qualities would seem to matter less as capital improvements continued. He had political reasons. A three-way contest between land, labor, and capital is a lot more complex, and it's harder to sell a social conflict as a sort of mano-y-mano, OK Corral showdown between bourgeois and proletariat. So he had political reasons. He also had metaphysical and philosophical reasons. He was, after all, a Hegelian when all things are said and done. And for metaphysical reasons, he needed communism to be a synthesis of opposites. And you can't make a unity out of opposites from three terms. It just doesn't work. So there need to be two polarities, one that's everything and one that's nothing. So for all these reasons, land goes away. And what happens? Well, when land drops out of our core set of social concepts, we're left only with capital and labor. Once they're unmoored from the qualities of any specific location, they quickly become conceived as standardized, abstract, and placeless. Capital flows to wherever wages are lowest. Labor goes to wherever wages are highest. Labor becomes conceived as a homogeneous block, undifferentiated by local heritage, customs, habits. And labor is thought to be measurable on a single standard basis, socially necessary labor time, as Marx put it, which is however long it takes an average person to do a particular type of work. And all of that can be measured on one single unvarying scale. Same thing with capital, standardized. A factory is a factory is a factory, able to generate a certain level of output wherever it is, independent of what or who surrounds it. Now, Marx may have meant all of that ironically, and I think there's a school of Marx interpretation that makes that case pretty convincingly. It was a big joke in a certain way, but even so, a lot of people haven't gotten the joke, and some of their names are up there on the screen. And just think about interpretations of the social effects of globalization and the internet. Death of distance, world is flat, and all of that. And the assumption is, of course, that different kinds of work can be done equally well from everywhere. It will flow to wherever it can be done most cheaply. And that means that attachment, persistent attachment by people, firms, to a particular place has to be thought of as a kind of persistent, stubborn irrationality, which we would expect would eventually give way to more abstract and global standards that should hold everywhere equally. Okay, now back, so that's why we lost the land. Now back to the land. Okay, so there's another tradition in which land has always been important, but in a different kind of sense. It also is complex, but the key figures I'm going to talk about are the ones in the bottom there. Max Weber and Alfred Marshall. Talcott Parsons is sort of in the middle. Now, the key thing that these people shared is Marshall and Weber especially, is this deep sensitivity to the fateful economic consequences in what the classical economists called habit and custom, and which we might call culture. Now, that's in Smith, it's in Ricardo, it's Marx, but they downplayed it. Now, Parsons, when he wrote the book Economy and Society with Neil Smeltzer, and they elaborated that idea, the idea that there's a connection between a focus on customs, habits, culture, and land. And this is the kind of thinking that they articulated. Calvinist theology, so this is the Weber, is not inherently economically oriented any more than is Mother Earth's soil. But that theology, for reasons that Weber, of course, famously articulated, makes work into a calling. And the result is, therefore, that where there are more Calvinists, there are more people devoted to doing their work largely independent of economic considerations like wages. They will work hard, they'll throw themselves into their tasks as if their souls depended on it, because, of course, they do. Now, if you think about it from a perspective of a firm, that's a good place to locate if you need workers. It's not such a good place to locate to sell things, like colorful clothing, but that's a different kind of story. And the upshot of all of that is that variation, spatial variation in the commitment to work in a calling is, as Parsons and Smeltzer put it, a non-economic given that has huge economic consequences. So a firm with similar tools and with people who work about the same amount of time, labor and capital, is going to be differentially successful based on its location relative to people with these habits. Okay, so that's back to the land. So you see up in the upper right, that's Calvin, just FYI. So on to the scene. So we're back to the, we lost the land, now back to the scene. So one way to think about what Terry and I have been doing with this idea of scenes as a kind of extension, specification of this Weber, Marshall, Parsons, Smeltzer kind of line, even though there's a lot of other intellectual influences too. And the key idea, again, is just intuitively simple, okay? And it's that places differ quite sharply in terms of the opportunities that they afford to cultivate a whole range of experiences. They include, those experiences include the kind of impassioned dedication to work characteristic of Weber's Puritan, but the range of possibilities is much greater now. There are places that encourage you to be glamorous. That's Hollywood in the middle there. To express their uniqueness. That's the upper right is a person in Wicker Park. To break normal standards of appearance. Upper left, that's Haight-Ashbury. To connect to a tradition, to work hard, to be a good neighbor, community member, shop and eat local, all sorts of other things. And we can recognize those intuitively when we walk around from neighborhood to neighborhood. They can come in different degrees and combinations, hence these dimensions of meaning that Terry was talking about. Now, one thing I do just want to show, and then, of course, we can map them, and we can see significant variation. This is an extension of the kind of mapping Terry was doing. This maps Canada. Now, we've done the same kind of data collection in Canada. We actually have more data. We have about 1,800 different types of amenities for every Canadian postal code. This maps the degree to which that set of amenities sort of affirms tradition or not, darker, more traditional, lighter, less traditional. We have things, we have churches, schoolyards, playgrounds, cemeteries. We also have etiquette, protocol, teachers, right? So a whole bunch of those things. Tattoo parlors, okay, got it. Body art piercing studios, 20th century art galleries, the whole range of things. The main thing, we see a lot of variation. It's not random, there's patterns. Darker in the countryside, lighter in the big cities. If you go within the cities, there's different patterns you see too, even though they're all relatively less traditional than the rest of Canada. You can see that there's parts that affirm sort of rationalism a bit more. There's other parts that affirm individual self-expression or transgression a bit more. So, and those have, we can go into these maps later in more detail if you want, because they're really interesting differences between Toronto and Montreal and how these things are organized. The main difference is in Toronto, you'll have the sharpest difference sort of 2 blocks away between the most countercultural, let's say, and the most Wall Street, Bay Street buttoned down you could imagine, whereas in Montreal, there's a much sort of smoother gradation from one to the other. Toronto has about 110 nightclubs in it, 80 are in one neighborhood, right? Whereas Montreal has about 75, and they're kind of distributed all over the city. So it creates a very different feel when you walk around the city. We can measure that. Okay, so, I'm going back up. mass main point here. There we are. Okay, so this is the sort of underlying intuitive type of idea. Now, one thing to stress, again, just like in the Weber Puritan example, there's very little reason, I think, to believe that people are sort of pursuing these types of experiences for the sake of their economic consequences. I mean, the value of the scene lies in the experiences that it creates. Shining on the dance floor, being improvisational in a jazz club, being different than regular people in a goth club, feeling rooted at home in a local pub, and all of the rest, right? But where you have those kinds of experiences in the air, that's a phrase from Marshall. Marshall has become a classic in economic geography for people studying agglomeration effects. So when you have those experiences in the air, they're easily available, certain types of firms clearly have better chances of succeeding. For those scenes that cultivate those experiences are creating ambiances, inculcating commitments and types of motivations that might be valuable for different types of work. So now think again, not this time about two farmers, but two technology firms or video game design firms, let's say. And tech firm number one is located in a scene that encourages personal self-expression, so it has all these amenities in it that we say do that. And tech firm number two is in a scene that doesn't do that as much. So number one is like on the right side here, the upper right, that's a Google offices. The bottom right, that's a family in LA. The bottom left, we've got, cubes and a kind of a classical Main Street. That's actually Salinas, California, where I grew up. So number one, tech firm number one is where the state of the art in many ideas is being created, surrounded by an atmosphere that encourages, let's say, innovation, not sticking with convention, seeing things in a unique light. And that is good soil for a certain kind of work, certain type of firm that has use of those abilities, those commitments, those atmospheres. And they can rent those. And when they hire somebody or when they literally rent an office space. So you see the kind of logic of a kind of hypothesis here. In the same way that an artist, a farmer is going to be more or less successful based on the sort of soil that he's working in. Now we're not talking about dirt, but we're talking about the scene as the soil that provides this kind of non-economic background for developing skills, which can be economically quite important. So how can we test that idea? Here we go. This is another way of representing the interaction effect that Terry was showing before. It's the same sort of logic. You break up the whole country into all 40,000 zip codes into 5 groups. You rank those zip codes according to the degree to which the amenities in the zip code support personal self-expression. You look at technology, industry cluster, concentration across those groups, and you see if it's the case that where you have the tech clusters in a more self-expressive scene, you see robust economic growth relative to tech clusters located where you don't have such a scene that supports self-expression. And you see basically that the hypothesis seems to hold. As you go to the right, those are the higher quintiles. There's where you have the tech clusters in the self-expressive scene, there's more patents, entertainment patents, high-tech patents, there's more job growth. Same thing, same pattern for increases in college graduates, increases in population, increases in postgraduates, not shown here. When you go down to the bottom where you have technology industry clusters, but not in a very self-expressive scene, no growth, sometimes negative growth, okay? There's a lot of other ways we can show these types of relationships. I just want to show this last thing. This is another way of showing what, this is less of an interaction effect, but what all this implies, clearly, is that where you have these kinds of scenes, rents should be higher. There's something valuable going on there. And this just shows that, in fact, yes, rents are really high in the self-expressive scenes and the glamorous scenes, as are a bunch of other things. And I mentioned this all just to note, too, that this is not the case in Canada. It's kind of an interesting question. In fact, so we see all of these indicators, same relationships between economic growth and a self-expressive or a glamorous scene in Canada. More jobs being created, more young people with university degrees are moving there. Wages are going up, but rents are not going up in those places. And so it's an interesting question about why that is. I have some ideas about that, which we could talk about later. But that's really sort of where I'm going to leave things. And let me just sort of conclude, hopefully in a sort of pithy way, summarizing what I've been trying to say. And so the main point is that if we want to include local effects in our theories, in our models, going back to the land is a good way to do so, but back to a kind of transformed, kind of culturally infused conception of the land. And to do that, we have to learn to look out at the world around us in a different way, not only as a landscape, but also as a scenescape. So thank you.
Thank you. Our last presentation is by David Harding, Cultural Mechanisms in Neighborhood Effects Research. Then after this presentation, we'll bring everybody up. And I'm sorry, then we have a discussion from Liz Gaumer. Then we'll bring everybody up and have questions.
Okay, well, I want to start by thanking the committee that's organizing this conference for inviting me. This is, I think, my third Urban Network conference, and they're always great, so I keep coming back. My goal here is relatively modest. What I want to do is just kind of discuss the current state of what I think of as kind of a nascent literature that's a subpart of the neighborhood effects literature, the literature on culture and neighborhood effects, and particularly thinking about cultural things as part of the processes or mechanisms behind neighborhood effects. And so obviously, culture is just one of many mechanisms, a lot of which we heard this morning from Rob, but things like social organization, institutions, environmental hazards, the built environment, the amount of violence, and so on. When I do talk about examples, which given the time I won't have too many, but a lot of this research is about young people and neighborhood effects on young people, so I'll be talking about adolescents, but we should think more broadly than that generically. And the other thing I just focus mainly on sort of theoretical concepts and only touch on methodology a little bit, given that we have a whole panel on methodology later. So just to fix ideas, and since we're in an interdisciplinary context, I'm going to say a little bit about what I mean by cultural mechanisms and neighborhood effects. And then I've kind of loosely divided the theoretical perspectives into two categories. One is those that are kind of explicitly part of this literature, and then others that we can draw from either other parts of the neighborhood effect literature or from other literatures entirely. And this is sort of in the spirit of kind of throwing out some ideas about what we should do next. So the way I view things, and if people disagree, I'd like to hear it, is that kind of what I'm going to call the sort of deviant subculture view of sort of culture in poor neighborhoods is almost of the implicit or dominant view. That term is my own because there was sort of no term for it. And then the cultural heterogeneity perspective, is full disclosure, sort of my challenge to that view. So you should take my preferences with a little grain of salt. And then I'll talk about some of the conceptual and methodological challenges we face in going forward, and maybe some things we can do both in the long and the short term. Okay, so what do we mean by neighborhood effects? This is similar to Rob's diagram and similar to one I think Pat's going to use later today. Right. So we have some neighborhood characteristics like their composition or their structural position, and we want to know how that affects individual outcomes. We observed that something like, say, teenage childbearing is higher in certain types of neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, and the literature tends to focus on neighborhood poverty or other things that are correlated with that. Or we could talk about health outcomes like heart attack rates or so on. And then what we're trying to do is kind of understand what the process is. And I tend to think about it as a set of causal effects to sort of break down the process into its pieces. So the first part is to think about what is the cultural context of a poor neighborhood? How do we describe it? How do we think about? How do we theorize it? And so that's the first arrow, and then the second one is what effect does that have on the individuals living there? Right, that's sort of the neighborhood effect in a sense. And then so then how do those proximate things actually translate into outcomes? Obviously, there's a lot of the proximate things we're talking about. We go to the whatever substantive literature we're working on for the outcome to see that connection. So I'm kind of, this is just one definition of mechanism. This is from the Hedstrom and Ilikoski paper that was in Annual Review of Sociology. As the cogs and wheels of the causal process through which the outcome to be explained was brought about. And then, so, we also need to worry about these dotted lines. There's another one, those kind of, in this sort of simple diagram, encode the other possible mechanisms. And a big challenge for the cultural mechanisms folks is sort of differentiating these from other ones that are already in the literature. Okay, so what is this, what I'm characterizing as the dominant account? I'll just call it subculture for short from here forward. So the idea here is that poor neighborhoods are socially and economically isolated. They're an environment where there's blocked opportunities, conventional paths such as work and schooling, and that the combination of those two things leads to a culture that's different from the mainstream. Okay, so kind of a core idea here is that there's social isolation and there's some sort of cultural difference that's showing up. And so often, but not always, this is called an oppositional culture to sort of signal the contrast with quote-unquote mainstream culture, which is also, by the way, not always specified what exactly that means. So youth are socialized into this kind of culture, and then that affects their behavior. And there's some implicit assumptions here. These models tend to think of culture as values, so culture as ends, or not necessarily use the term value, but something else that refers to sort of specifying the ends towards which people should strive. So how much do you value marriage? How much do you value education or work and so on? The assumption tends to be that culture is something that's coherent and cohesive, right? So that all the pieces of the culture fit together. The culture itself doesn't have sort of contradictions within it. And then in order to explain differences in behavior, right? If a culture is coherent and cohesive and people conform to their culture, then if we see differences in behavior, people must be coming from different cultures, right? So we get this idea that poor neighborhoods are somehow culturally distinct. And then, when we start applying these kind of big conceptual ideas to neighborhood poverty, then we end up with this oppositional subculture sort of predominating in poor neighborhoods. Okay, so this is one typical example. This gets beaten up on a lot, but it's probably the one people most know. Obama talked about this in his in the 2008 campaign. So this idea of oppositional culture in education, that youth in poor, particularly black neighborhoods, are socialized into this culture which lowers their schooling effort, sort of defines achievement and effort as acting white, and so people, they sort of devalue education, don't put the effort in, and that affects their educational outcomes. And the evidence against this is, the evidence for this is pretty thin, and the evidence against it is pretty strong. I won't review it all here, but we don't really find evidence that there's greater sanctioning of school effort among African American adolescents. What this term "acting white" is a real term, but when Prudence Carter talked to kids about what that meant, it was more about your tastes for fashion, music, speech patterns, and so on, rather than okay. This is one example. The paper talks about some others. Other examples are Elijah Anderson's Baby Game explanation of teenage pregnancy in poor neighborhoods. The idea from criminology that there's a street culture or culture of honor that creates violence, and the segmented assimilation theory from the immigration literature also has this kind of subculture flavor to it. Okay, I'm sure we could think of some more examples. Okay, so what's the alternative? You can tell I don't like this theory very much. So this cultural heterogeneity idea comes from a kind of a critique of the subculture theory, which is that if we actually look at the data, whether it's survey data or ethnographic data about the poor or about people in poor neighborhoods, we find that there's actually, it doesn't look like sort of there's a set of oppositional cultural ideas that actually dominate, at least if you believe what people say or what they tell to ethnographers. Okay, so it's hard to think of sort of conforming to subculture as driving behavior in an environment where there's lots of different subcultures, lots of heterogeneity in the neighborhood. Okay, so we kind of need a new way of thinking about what culture is, and so what I do is kind of draw on what we would, I put in quotes, new cultural sociology. So this is people who do cultural sociology won't find this new. That's why it's in quotes. But For folks who work on poverty, we tend not to think about culture in this way. So this is a DiMaggio. From DiMaggio, culture is fragmented. It's composed of disparate bits of information and schematic structures that organize that information. You think of culture as a repertoire or a toolkit. So people have a sort of set of cultural models that they can deploy. And we use a different set of concepts. So rather than values, we use frames or scripts or narratives. Okay, so this is kind of a, for lack of a better term, kind of a cognitive view of culture. And so I'm brushing by a lot of theoretical ideas quickly. We can certainly return to them in the discussion. So what does this do for us if we're trying to understand the culture of poor neighborhoods? So this allows there to be kind of low levels of cultural coherence. So there can be lots of different ideas, cultural models, cultural beliefs present in the cultural environment without there having to be sort of a separate subculture. And that sort of matches the ethnographic description that there's these competing and conflicting cultural models. And then you can get behavioral variation without having to say that the people who are behaving differently come from a different subculture. Because people are taking in cultural ideas from their environment into their repertoire and then choosing to deploy them differently. So you can understand variation within neighborhoods and across neighborhoods. And this is also kind of a side bonus. You get kind of a more agentic kind of theory from this perspective. What's key here is that this view of culture allows communities and even individuals to hold multiple competing or contradictory notions at the same time, but variation is allowed. And so that kind of matches the data that we have about poor neighborhoods. And so if we're again back to adolescence, the qualitative literature shows that adolescents in disadvantaged neighborhoods confronted with multiple cultural models in their social environment. There's the person who's going to college or to work. There's the person who's standing on the street corner, getting into the type of trouble that Rob was talking about earlier. And so, that's fine. And from a theoretical perspective, so what is cultural heterogeneity? The presence of a wide array of competing and conflicting cultural models that have some degree of social support. And the idea here is that poor neighborhoods are going to have more of this cultural heterogeneity, okay? At least with regard to things that drive the outcomes that we care about. So I'm not talking about heterogeneity of religious perspectives or fashion or something like that. And this is not a new idea, actually. This goes all the way back, maybe even earlier than this, but it's explicit in Shaw and McKay, where they talk about delinquency being driven by differences. They don't use the term cultural heterogeneity, but differences in norms created by residential turnover and ethnic diversity and so on in the neighborhood. Okay. So what's the effect of all this? So we sort of have to imagine someone in this heterogeneous cultural environment. It means that their cultural repertoires, their toolkits are going to be much more diverse, right? And so they're going to have sort of a lot to sort of process and deal with and work with. So the individual will have a wider range of socially supported scripts and frames, for example, in his or her cultural repertoire. And so what I've done here is, I'm going to go quickly through 3 processes that, well, I may not have time to go through them, but I've identified sort of 3 types of processes through which you can have effects. I got to move quickly. Basically, it's a story that you should be less able to sort of realize your goals or act in ways consistent with your frames or narratives in an environment where you have to sort of, especially for a young person, have to deal with all this heterogeneity and sort of creating strategies of action for yourself, and that can have consequences. These are some of the ways. So this is just a quick summary. I could probably should have provided this as a handout of the different ways, differences between the 2 theories. Okay? A lot of these I've sort of said already. So one that I didn't is, what's the role of material circumstances and structural positions in the cultural heterogeneity theory? Since we're sort of thinking about culture as a repertoire toolkit, it's influencing the availability and deployment of cultural models. So what do people have access to culturally? What do they actually use to make decisions and construct strategies of action? Okay. All right, so that shouldn't be the whole story about culture in poor neighborhoods, and it's not. So what are some other ideas that might be useful? I kind of went back and forth on how I should fit this first set of ideas here. Obviously, these are ideas from the neighborhood effects literature. They're not normally thought about as cultural. It's nice to see Rob talking about collective efficacy as something cultural now. But they're sort of examples of people having collective beliefs about their own neighborhood, right? Another example is Mario's idea of neighborhood frames, where people have sort of a lens through which they understand the neighborhood that affects their involvement in the neighborhood, which affects neighborhood social organization and has all sorts of effects, other neighborhood effects. So this is kind of an example where the culture is playing a role in creating social organization or disorganization and interacting. Okay, so this is sort of in the neighborhood effects literature, but not necessarily thought of in the way I've been categorizing things. Another idea, so if we talk about collective beliefs about one's own neighborhood, there are collective beliefs about external institutions. Legal cynicism is one example. We heard about that earlier, but we could think of external institutions like the education system, the labor market, and so on. Cultural capital, so the question here is, does the set of institutions or people that one comes into contact with in a certain neighborhood, does that provide you with a certain set of cultural capital? Can the neighborhood influence cultural capital? I don't think we know the answer to that question. And then we have this larger set of literature on cultural amenities. We heard a lot about scenes just now. So, for example, does a diversity of scenes in a neighborhood, how does that link with the idea of cultural heterogeneity? What does that provide people in the neighborhood with? Can a young person who growing up in a poor neighborhood that is near another neighborhood has access to a different set of scenes, does that provide them with a set of cultural capital? These are all connections that we haven't really made as yet. Okay. So there's a lot of challenges here. One of them is, as I said, the interrelationships among the cultural concepts. So what's the relationship between cultural heterogeneity and cultural capital, external versus internal perspectives on culture? Another one is distinguishing our concepts from similar ones in other fields or other disciplines. So an example would be, institutions are kind of a part of the neighborhood effects story. If we're measuring scenes by businesses and organizations, how does that relate to the idea of institutions? And then, the example from another discipline, there are some psychologists in the room. I'm sure they're wondering, what's the difference between a frame and an attitude? Something we should think about as well. We don't do very much, or at least much systematically, to theorize how cultural transmission occurs in neighborhoods. So, who is influencing whom? What are the kind of cultural conduits through which culture is transmitted? What's the effect of that? What's the actual content of what's being transmitted? This is sort of the social organization, kind of cultural organization issue. And then the other is, which we've alluded to before, I think, in the discussion, is that individuals are embedded within multiple cultural contexts. So you can't just sort of look at how an individual sort of responds to a cultural question on a survey and assume that their neighborhood they're in is driving that. People are embedded in all sorts of other cultural contexts, whether it's schools, families, religious institutions, and so on. And so what you're probably realizing here, as I'm going through this quickly, is we have a lot of conceptual work to do. There's a lot of fuzzy cultural concepts. How they relate to other things is fuzzy. And I think a big part of this is that we don't do a very good job of measuring culture, at least outside of qualitative work. So we could imagine sort of trying to measure narratives or frames in the context of a survey, but I don't think we really have the tools to do that, either at the individual or the neighborhood level. Ecometrics sort of provides us with the methodological tools, but what sort of set of survey questions, for example, to apply to that is unclear. Okay, thanks, Patrick. So where does this leave us? Maybe it's too pessimistic. But the dominant perspective is sort of in question. There aren't that many empirical tests of the alternative perspectives. I've heard from people that they're starting to do their own tests of cultural heterogeneity ideas, but none of those have made it into print yet. We have many potentially fruitful but unelaborated and untested concepts. And so we have a lot of work to do. What should we do? Certainly if we're talking about culture, we have to keep doing qualitative work, given that qualitative work is well suited to subjective understandings and processes. But I think we need to do so if we're going to talk about cultural context of neighborhoods. We need to do so in an explicitly comparative way. So we need to really understand how neighborhoods are different from one another, include them in our research designs, and how families and individuals within neighborhoods are different or similar to one another across. And then, the trick here is also linking this to individual outcomes, right? If we think back to the diagram I started with, doing that is going to require some following over time. And that's been part of the weakness of my own qualitative work. Quantitatively, there's stuff we can do in the short term. Obviously, we can use existing surveys, right? We have plenty of longitudinal surveys. We can link neighborhoods. Using admin data, we can explore and test ideas. But in the long term, we really need to develop the tools to measure cultural concepts both at the individual and the neighborhood level if we're going to address this topic quantitatively and be able to test any of these cultural mechanisms against other mechanisms. Okay, I will stop there. And
Thank you. Our discussant for this session is Liz Gommer.
Hi, everybody. So let me start. Thank you very much. I should say that I only have 10 minutes, so as challenging as this has been for everyone who's come before, although I am only a discussant, I'm going to try to actually hold it to my 10 minutes. So please be aggressive with timekeeping. So let me start with a little bit of a disclaimer that goes with my disclaimer here, which is that although I have the University of Chicago up there as a co-affiliation, you'll see in the program that I'm really a policy person. So in this sort of vein of transdisciplinary sharing, I may be the only policy person actually here today. So that's both exciting and daunting. But I'm doing social and cultural mechanisms and discussing some really rich intellectual work. And as a policy person in my day-to-day sort of life, that's sadly a stretch, I think, for a lot of my colleagues that work in municipal and even federal government to start thinking about this. But it's, of course, incredibly important. The sort of efforts are long and far-reaching. And, of course, we know the sort of black box of neighborhood effects has been the thing that sort of we all talk about maybe all the way back for the 100 years that we've been discussing neighborhood effects. So this is remarkably similar to what David just showed, but on the left we could put structure, we could put composition. On the right, this is sort of meant to be individual outcomes. But in some ways, to Rob's point, we could think about context itself as sort of something worthy of studying. And in fact, I think a lot of the scenes literature starts to do exactly that, which is great. So, and I think as David pointed out, that the idea of cultural mechanisms in particular is not meant to be singular at all. It is meant to be complementary, at times contradictory, to other ideas and the theories of the mechanisms that link neighborhood to whatever outcomes that are of interest and relevance. And that I think there's actually quite a bit of sort of in between, back and forth, it talks among these different mechanisms too, that it's trying to bring culture back into neighborhood effects thinking, which it hasn't been there for a long time until recently. Is also, it's important to think that culture, all of these different things we can think of in a cultural way, or many of them in a social way, that there may in fact not be such a strong boundary between the social and cultural, or frankly between structural and these other more contextual factors as well. That makes for a lot of methodological challenges, but I think it allows us to have a kind of richness of thinking about how local areas really matter. Okay, so a couple of just very high-level things that sort of I got from the presentations, but also from reading the papers, is this in bringing culture back into the conversation. First and foremost, there has been a real turn away from, I think, what previous cultural mechanism thinking has been, which is culture as a set of coherent values. And I think David articulated this very, very well. And certainly away from this entire culture of poverty idea that I think really is what has set thinking about culture and neighborhood back as far as we now are. And it's really exciting to see sort of new theories and new levels of engagement and really interesting and great work like we've heard about today. So the turn away from culture of poverty thinking and that kind of singularity and coherence that is passively and sort of holistically consumed by residents or whomever it's directed towards is now being replaced with sort of this idea of richness and complexity, that we have in fact culture as something that is not a culture at all. It is in fact not something that an individual or a group has, but rather that individuals or groups are embedded within a context that itself can be somewhat contradictory or overlapping or diametrically defined depending on what your own individual perspective is on it. And we see this in the scenes sort of approach in general as well, that there are multiple dimensions that we can think of, that we can aggregate out of amenities, and that those multiple dimensions themselves may or may not actually fit very neatly together. So we see this sort of two ways, the two projects that we just heard about across the three papers, sort of pointing to this idea of complexity and things that are, of course, not singular or coherent. So some of the things that I liked that I sort of saw the three different papers fitting together on and underscoring, that, of course, cultural context is an emergent phenomena, and that sort of goes without saying probably with the people in this room. One of the things that I particularly liked about this was that it didn't assume that neighborhood, residential neighborhood at least, was the end-all be-all of the sort of area of importance. So the idea that not only are we embedded within different contexts, including ones that are not necessarily grounded in the local at all, so we can think about the national media as a sort of cultural context that we're embedded in, but also that we have multiple neighborhoods that we inhabit and a variable kind of life space that is part of our daily round and the actual use value of the geography. So that's, I think, a really important takeaway. The other thing, and this is particularly true of the scenes literature because there's just an incredible amount of spatial resolution that they were able to achieve with this data, that I think it's really important to remember that there is no middle town, right? And we've seen this in a lot of the neighborhood effects debates as of recently, that Chicago itself may or may not be able to represent certain aspects of other cities. New York, which is where I do a lot of my work, certainly is not the same as Chicago or LA or other places. Yes, I see Mario shaking his head up there. So it's important, but by trying to really think about at once theory that is actually generalizable, or at least some aspect of it, that sort of theoretical and heuristic approach is a really important part of then drilling down and understanding regional variations, differences between neighborhoods within a given city or region or area, thinking about city and suburban differences and how those things actually relate to one another. And I think a lot of this work actually allows for that multiplicity of experience, not just for individuals who maybe have cultural heterogeneity within their own neighborhood as well as the multiple neighborhoods they inhabit, but then also for one place to the next, that the actual meaning of the model and the variables can invert or change depending on that context itself. So one of the things, and there was some talk first thing this morning about how theory and methods really shouldn't be thought of as siloed separate things. And I think one of the really nice things about this panel has been that we have sort of a theoretical and fairly grounded in ethnographic and qualitative thinking, way of thinking about cultural heterogeneity. But then we also have this sort of second set of papers that are using massive amounts of administrative data and secondary data on amenities to be able to try to quantify this idea of culture and place. And that's fairly novel, and I think there are things to be learned from either one. So I think of cultural context as inherently thick. I think many of us do. We think about it as a qualitative enterprise, and that sort of is the natural mode that we would want to study it with. But here we have this opportunity to think about how we can do it quantitatively. And the scenes approach, I think, starts to do that. So taking multiple sources of data, not only survey data, but really rich administrative data, things like scraping data from the yellow pages and other sources that we don't typically think of for social science research, and using that to actually try to see the forest from the trees. I think that's a novel approach. I think it's one that we're probably all will increasingly do now that we have the kind of computing power that we have access to, and it's terrific. For this reason, the sort of scenes and thinking about amenities as a marker of cultural context also gives us the opportunity to think about a given neighborhood's context as both the product, sort of cause and effect of both local residents, but also non-residents, right? So in thinking about amenities research, particularly, not every Starbucks in a given neighborhood is only frequented by people who live there. It is actually produced by a much broader set of market forces, capitalist functions, and ultimately it is consumed by people that may or may not actually be part of that local context. And yet, the amenities in a given area are part of the cultural context that area residents, regardless of whether they're direct consumers or not, are actually influenced by. And I think that's an interesting takeaway from this work. To David's point, that I think that scenes may be at least an opportunity to start thinking about how cultural transmission occurs, in this idea that secondary people are actually exposed to something that is not necessarily generated entirely within the chicken and egg of the neighborhood. And that, of course, different amenities may help to actually be the form of social support that help to increase the likelihood that one repertoire versus another will be utilized. I'm out of time, I know. So just a couple of things that I think with the good also comes challenges that are really important that will help us to refine our thinking moving forward. A lot of neighborhood effects research is grounded in the study of poor neighborhoods and how living in concentrated poverty can affect the life chances of poor individuals. I think the scenes work, and in fact, a lot of our discussion has been very telling that we have moved, it's a very important question, continued, but that we have moved beyond that to try to think about neighborhood effects, not only those of poor neighborhoods and poor individuals. And the scenes literature does that. However, maybe to the other extreme, that I don't know that it actually captures or describes the cultural context or the embeddedness of disadvantaged individuals or neighborhoods as well as perhaps it could or should. So it's something to think about. I will skip over causation because that's, of course, an entire thing in and of itself, and hopefully we'll spend a lot of time talking about it this afternoon. But the last one I actually see as really sort of a gauntlet being thrown out to all of us in this scholarly world, which is that regardless of how elegant and powerful a theoretical orientation is, or even coding methodology and analysis, that it's really ultimately that the quality of our work collectively is determined by the data that goes into it. And PhDCN is a great, remarkable thing that I'm sure we have all used and relied on at one point in time. It actually does a second thing, which is gives us a model of thinking about how the idea of collective efficacy as a mechanism has been able to spread beyond the PhDCN because of the replication of those survey questions, and also the strength of the theory that then can be extrapolated and really picked apart in different areas. If we're to really get serious about culture, we need to be serious about it from a data perspective as well as a theory perspective. So the next steps that I took from these papers, and many of these David actually was very explicit about and much more eloquent in how he said them. But we need to think about the meaning of neighborhood. I think all of us here today show that neighborhood itself and local area and place matters. But we need to continue to articulate and think about why and what kind of neighborhood and neighborhood defined in which way is the most important thing. I think that scenes can continue to sort of evolve beyond its 15 dimensions. And that I think we need to think about whether it matters whether cultural mechanisms are different than social mechanisms or other kinds of things that go into this model. The answer to that, by the way, may be no. I really am not sure. And then I think we do need to think about how this leads to individual outcomes and heterogeneity. The powerful thing about bringing culture back to the table is that culture as a sort of meaning-making can actually help to not only explain differences between neighborhoods, but also differences in outcomes between individuals that experience the same kind of structural features of place. And so that's really powerful, and I think probably the next step for many of us in the field. On the bottom here is just that we really need to think about data tools. We need to develop survey measures. We need to actually try to disseminate the use of those. And that really, as somebody who, here, I'll bring it back, that somebody who works in a municipal agency that produces administrative data, there's a lot of give there. So I think we should all advocate for better data, and that we should collaborate and engage with the groups that are already doing this anyway, instead of just using it sort of and assuming that it just is what it is. This isn't something that comes off the shelf, and we should advocate for what we need. Thank you very much.
Could the presenters come up, please, and we'll start with questions. Kristen, go ahead.
Hi. So this may actually be a premature question that may be applicable to all the speakers moderators this afternoon as well. But this is a wonderful language for something to sit out outside of writers and learning about the language. That's great. But I was wondering if anyone wanted to speak a little bit about, more about genetics and biology. Not so genetics. I mean, it relates to causality to some degree, but much more about the really exciting work about how neighborhoods and social contexts can change neurobiology, how sensitivity to environment may be, related to certain biomarkers, and not just would this help us understand the mediational pathways, but would thinking about that change your theories at all, like change how you think about the world. So I don't know, very vague, I don't know.
Really nice to start with an easy question. Anybody want to address that at all? And if if there's anybody else who wants to address it, this is a big conversation.
Yeah, I would call or just mention we have a collective project, and with Louise Hockley and Linda Waite in particular we've been merging data explicitly to include data with biomarkers along with cultural data, along with poverty, along with crime, precisely to try to address the question that you pose. So we don't have lots of precise answers, but we completely agree with it. If maybe Linda or Louise want to mention some of the specific.
Well,
surveys.
a couple things that I could say is that a number of large-scale national surveys have recently collected genetic material and are doing assays, genotyping. The National Social Life, Health and Aging Project, NCHAP, collected genetic material. We haven't genotyped anything yet. The Health and Retirement Study has genotyped data for all of their respondents, and that's 20,000 people who have been followed for more than 20 years. A number of others, Ad Health, the study of adolescent health has genetic information. So that's becoming available and is starting to find its way. Ideas about the gene-environment and importance of gene-environment interactions is starting to find its way into theories in sociology, but I think sociology is way behind psychology in this. But this is something that's just starting. Some surveys are now, as Terry pointed out, collecting biological and physiological and functional measures. So we can start doing things on disease processes, on stress reactivity, which of course would be very important in any study of the social context, and especially the relationship between vulnerability to various kinds of environmental effects like stress exposure to infection, or needs us as much as it needs biologists and geneticists. Louise, do you want to say something? And then Rob?
Well, just to reinforce
Louder if you can.
the genetic part is another context.
Oh, sure. Oh, okay. Okay. So, I think you should turn the mic. Okay.
But I also, not just but just really the idea that when the biology, the neurobiology changes, you don't act as rational decision makers anymore. And I sort of think that comes into play to some degree in terms of kind of the coherence or the consistency of neighborhoods, how people end up kind of in the same place over time, how they develop schemas about how they relate to their environments more broadly. So I think it's just a really great, really interesting.
I'd say from our scene standpoint, our goal is to incorporate the emotions, the affect, the experience, not just purely cognitive models. However, in the same sense that Freud tried to systematically and rationally build a model of the id, and the unconscious, we're trying to build coherent models, but we definitely want to include the underpinnings and biomarkers, et cetera, and more generally to incorporate the emotions as well as the more cognitive elements within the social sciences in a more coherent way than we have today.
Rob?
Oh, sure. This is non-biology, but just a couple comments and questions on both papers. Fascinating session. On the first, just a comment or curiosity that some of the literature on consumption and advertisers and data mining on patterns, I was reminded of that, where you can get really highly refined maps and typologies, really, of characteristics. I don't know if you've looked into that literature at all, and some of them I think would probably correspond to some of yours, and it does show what you can get out of these high resolution types of data sets. One question I had, I was just curious that in a sense, to me, scene is something that can be taken down. It's not fixed, right? And so I really love the map of the Big Five. I was glad to see that the Northeast is highly neurotic. Is that absolutely true? I mean, there it was, it's just, that verified everything for me. But I don't know how many psychologists here, but the idea of the Big Five is that those are stable traits, right? So I'm just curious, theoretically, how does personality and the fact that this is neurotic or not, how does that fit with the scene? I didn't quite get that, because that seems to me to be a different construct altogether. And secondly, I do think, and Liz brought this up, the causality question should be addressed, right? So Ed Glazer has criticized Richard Florida's work on the issue you had talked about in terms of what's attracting what, right? I mean, Glazer, of course, is arguing that you have certain human capital skills and so forth that are attracting industries, which then, in turn, the high education human capital folks want, not necessarily Starbucks, but they want scenes, they want bars and good cocktails and all that kind of thing. So, I'm a little worried about that causality bit. So that's just two questions and a comment. And then for David, I've always liked the cultural heterogeneity bit when you first started to do that. I think it's very useful. My only question is, it's sort of at what level do you stop? And what I mean by that is you said it provides sort of a low level, I think that's what you said, low level attention to cultural differences. But if it gets too low, then in a sense you're talking about an individual, right? And so culture, well, maybe you think differently, but culture, to me, it seems like the power of culture is that it's intersubjective, right? So to the extent that you're going down, and what I don't like about the toolkit argument, at least part of it, is the notion that, you have all this, it's almost purely choice. People are walking around, I can pick this, I can pick that. And to that extent, it's almost like you have different tastes and so forth. And to me, at least some versions of the toolkit literature, it seems like then that's much more of an individual kind of appropriation. It's not telling us about the deep cultural structures between or intersubjective that actually have power. And there's been pushback, as you know, against that move. People like Steve Vasey and others are saying, well, are you really giving up on the idea that culture has the power to motivate? I mean, is that really, how far down do we want to go? I mean, I think that's problematic. And I think that some of the evidence suggests that there are, I mean, I don't know what you want to call it, but norms. You know, we're not talking about a sort of straw man Parsonian end values, which is typically used as the critique, but the concept of a norm that exists in whether it's public spaces or in organizations seems to me to be more stable and has more potential power as a social construct than the toolkit. So I guess my question would be sort of what's the value added of the two? I mean, I'm not asking you to, you know, defend Swidler against all this, but I mean, but it does seem, and I don't think the cultural heterogeneity is it's not totally linked to that, but I do think once you go down too far, then you've sort of given up a lot on the power of a norm, and I'll just leave it at that.
So,
Use the mic.
oh, yeah, sure. A couple of quick things first. So question number one, sort of how stable are these types of things? I think one of the messages is sort of like what you were saying, is that they're in a way more stable than you might think. I mean, that these aesthetic characteristics of a place, we think of them as sort of coming and going, but I mean, just think intuitively for a second. Haight-Ashbury is Haight-Ashbury, right? And it's been that way for a long time. In Toronto, Queen West has a certain kind of vibe, and it's a character. It's changed. There's more Starbucks, more chain stores there, but nevertheless, it's there, sort of, you know, in the furniture of the city in a way. So that's number one. Now, you know, how do we show that? How do we see that? You know, I mean, we did. Chris there may be able to say a bit more about this, but you know, we tried to look at. We have a bit of overtime data. We don't have so much, but they collect the census business data every year in the U.S. I think twice a year in Canada. So we have that for about 12 years, and we saw very little actual overtime variation. You know, some stuff at the edges here and there, but not much. So they're part of, you know, the world. That's so, and they change in, you know, slow ways sometimes, fast ways other times. So that's number one. And then on the causality chicken egg thing, maybe Terry can say a bit more, but we've been doing some stuff on that with those same kinds of overtime data, and the answer in the end is sort of both. You know, sometimes we've been doing it with artists and jobs. So is it the artists going to the jobs, or the jobs going to the artists? And certain or both, right? Sometimes one or both. Sometimes one precedes the other. Sometimes one precedes the other. Sometimes both are happening at the same time. But you can kind of map where you have one or the other, and when and why you have one and not the other. That's the next big question. We're not quite there yet. But Harry could say something more. I don't know about that.
Okay. Yeah, good. There are two or three interrelated kinds of themes. Thanks, Rob. And you're relating to stability and overtime change is certainly excellent, as David also stressed the importance of looking at explicitly. The economist method are the classics here, but rather than trying to get into identifiers and so forth, we tried where possible to use overtime data. That's the simplest and easiest. And what we've especially focused on, somehow maybe 8-10 years ago, Mario Small and I and about 2 other people in the world found what's called BizZip. And I'm sort of mentioning this because this is a very valuable set of data for all kinds of local area effects and other things, and almost no one knows about it or is using it. It's not published. You don't read reports of it. You've got to drill down within the unpublished files of the U.S. Census of business, and you can find there the number of human rights organizations, of environmental organizations, of political organizations in every zip code in the United States for every year for about 20 to 30 years. So with this, we built.
Could we just add one small thing?
Go ahead.
I mean, so we got the same thing in Canada too, and I think that I was maybe one of the first people to ever ask for it there, because they gave it to me in ways that violated, I think, their own rules. But nobody had ever asked for it, you know, so they didn't know that they were doing it. Anyway,
Okay. And in many other countries of the world, the same thing is true. I mean, we're digging out these things which are down there, but no one has asked before. So point one. Point two. We're then doing things like cross-lagged regression, where we have measures of the number of artists, and as Dan pointed out, the number of jobs over year by year by year by year, and you can see which is increasing first and which is a driver of the other. In that process, we're finding that is, the best work on this was really done by econometricians about 30 years ago, urban economists and econometricians. Then it dropped out, and almost no one has done work on this that I've seen for a long time. But what we're trying to do now is to look at not just most of the econometric work was national. You take all the counties in the U.S. and then you look at this. But what they didn't generally look at why in some counties are culture and arts more important, like L.A., where in others it's very weak. More the case for Chicago, for instance. Although and so this is how newer geographic techniques like geographically weighted regression could potentially point to different models in different local areas. So that's the direction that we're trying to push in. Similarly, when I mentioned the permanent community sample at NORC, this was founded by really the idea of combining data from surveys of individuals with the context, the sampling points that NORC used, which have then continued over time. So we have a permanent community sample, a resampling with all the NORC surveys of the context of everybody in Waukegan, Illinois, and so forth, with a national sample of cities. That was really the beginning of a lot of this kind of thinking and this the NORC inspiration. I'd also add briefly, okay, so Florida, Glaser, and Lloyd, sort of the dynamics of economic growth and gentrification and the interpenetration of culture with economic growth. I mean, Florida and Lloyd had a strong argument from Richard Lloyd book on Wicker Park, which is which was a generally poor area, became an artist area, and now it's become highly gentrified with still a bohemian reputation, but the artists can no longer afford to live there. So it's a classic story of artists coming in and moving out. So at least that's one story of culture and so the point of that story would be, in this kind of model, the scene of bohemia should drive the change only in the middle period. That is, in the first period, people may be fighting against it, but later on the artists may move out. We've tried to generalize that and see how well does this hold, for instance, in Japan and Korea and China. The answer, I mean, the striking answer, Florida and I were there advising the mayor of Seoul on these issues, and the striking thing we found in talking with them was there's no bohemia in Korea. We asked about, how about gays? There was a famous TV announcer who came out 5 years ago. He got fired. He couldn't get a job for 2 years. He committed suicide, and it's considered a national difficult case. Gays. Okay, so gays were the hot issue that Florida introduced. Both Ed Glaser and I got his data. Okay. And we completely agree, gays were spurious. The driver was human capital measured by college graduates. So Florida was wrong because he used 50 metro areas. When we drill down to all the counties and smaller units like zip codes, spurious. So I should end there. So.